Video lesson 2.4, the Han Dynasty. So this will cover kind of where we picked up from last video lesson. I will review a little bit of the dynasties, and we will jump into studying the Han Dynasty, which is the classical age of China. So just as a refresher, last video we went over the period of 7 warring states and how those different philosophies emerged out of that period of chaos. So that lasted from about 403 BC, and I'm sorry, this should say 221 BCE, so not CE. And then in 221 BCE, the Qin dynasty took control of China and united those 7 warring kingdoms, and they became one China. Remember, we talked about how that came from the word Qin. But the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi, was a very harsh ruler, and he only ruled for about 10 years, and then his son quickly lost control, not able to maintain that strict rule. So then we have the emergence of the Han Dynasty, which lasts from about 400 years. We have about 200 years BCE, and then 220 years CE is when the Han Dynasty is said to decline. So this is putting it all in context for us here. Alright, so just a little more detail on Qin Shi Huangdi. Like I said, he used legalism to enforce that strict rule in China following the period of 7 warring states. He was famous for his brutal, ruthless rule. And he established order, but he also repressed education, the arts, etc. So even though he was united the people were not necessarily flourishing as they would under various other philosophies or kinds of rule. So, like I said, after Qin Shi Huangdi, he's seen, first of all, he dies, but in a dynastic situation, his son would normally take power. However, his son was not as strong of a ruler and was not as effective. So the Han Dynasty ultimately are the ones to take power after the decline of the Qin. So the people recognized that the Han were better rulers, therefore the Han can say, oh, we got the mandate of heaven, so we are in charge because you allow us to be in charge. So this begins the classical age of China. So the definition of a classical age is regarding as the exemplary or standard for something. So exemplary means like the prime example, the first significant period of study. So that's why we didn't really go into too much depth about the Shang and the Zhou and the 7 warring states and the Qin. So the Han are really what is known as classical. If you think of classical European society, you're thinking of the Greeks and the Romans. So when we think about classical China, we think Han China. And Han China moved away from the legalism of Qin Shi Huangdi to the defining practices of Confucianism. So yes, if you remember from class today, we talked about Ban Chou and her use of Confucianism and her reflection of those Confucius beliefs. So the practices of Han China became the classical for Chinese society. So I just want to set us up a little bit for our ultimate goal here. We want to take a look at how China is staying the same over time throughout all these different dynasties and how China is changing. So first of all, the consistencies or the continuities that we're talking about. The mandate of heaven is still emphasized and still validates leadership in China. Again, because of that, the dynastic cycle continues. So when one dynasty takes power, they slowly restore order and establish peace. However, sometimes they decline and become corrupt. Other disasters such as floods, famines, revolts, invasions occur. So the old dynasty is seen as having lost the mandate of heaven, and a dynasty is overthrown through that rebellion, and that new dynasty gains power. So again, we're focusing over here on that dynastic cycle. There's also this notion of a social elite. So people, there's strict social classes, and part of this is based on Confucianism. However, the Han Dynasty incorporates Confucianism even further into their government system. So they focus on education, morals, and subservience. That idea that one person is more powerful than another and one person should be dutiful to another. So if we're thinking about Ban Chou, the wife was dutiful or subservient to her husband. To incorporate more people into government, they initiated the civil service examination. So this meant that qualified and not just rich people were in jobs. And not only were they in just any jobs, but they were in government jobs, which was organized into a bureaucracy. So if you remember from our excerpts, the government is now being based on good people and not just on people who you know, because and you know they are good because they take this civil service examination. So how did the Han Dynasty rise to power? In the years following Shi Huangdi's death, there was a civil war in China, and that lasted for about 4 years. The Han Dynasty was eventually established in 206 BCE. Once again, they centralized leadership and moved decidedly away from those harsh legalist practices. So here are the Confucian relationships that kind of drove the social characteristics of Han China. Confucianism has these 5 relationships that they emphasize throughout society: husband and wife, parent and child, older friend and younger friend, older sibling and younger sibling, and ruler and subject. Now, in all of these, I have the dominant role of the partnership or the relationship in red, and I have the subservient role in green. So our first relationship here is what we studied in class today, the relationship between husband and wife. This same relationship of subservience and respect and honor carries on through all these other different relationships. So this meant that there was a system of feudalism. So feudalism, it means that there is power based on a division of land. There are strict social hierarchies here. So the emperor is at the top, followed by kings who govern portions of the territory, and then anyone who owned land, they would be the feudal lords. Those who worked for them but did not own land were subservient to their feudal lords. So we can see it's kind of broken down. So we might have these two be responsible to this guy, these two be responsible to this guy, etc. There was also the lowest class of slaves. Slavery was not a new idea in terms of Africans being enslaved by Europeans and taken to the Americas. And we'll get to that in our 6th unit in a little more detail, but just be aware that many civilizations throughout history had slavery, and it was not based on race. It was also a patriarchy. So you see I have a little picture of Mulan down here. Mulan was actually a story from Han China that Disney turned into a very lovely movie. But if you remember the opening scenes from Mulan, Mulan is very kind of getting ready to become a wife. So this is exactly what Ban Shou was talking about. She is being educated to be a dutiful and respectful wife to a husband. And so this meant that men were much more powerful in society than women, and women had to be subservient to men. This creates what's called a patriarchy. So the woman's duty was to be subservient to men. Again, the Han Dynasty expanded ancient Chinese empire to roughly about the size of modern China, largely through war. So they were great warriors. And they recreated that bureaucracy, that organized government based on Confucianism. And Confucianism became the official state philosophy in 136 BCE. So the government's duty was to serve and respect people's needs. The people's duty was to be subservient and honorable, respectful to their government. So again, we see this relationship where one role is subservient to another. This is based on Confucius' 5 relationships. So here is roughly about the size of Han China. The Qin, remember, in the 7 warring states was kind of over like here, all the way to Chang'an. But the Han expanded it all the way up here. I want to talk about the Great Wall of China for just a moment. So the Qin dynasty initiated the Great Wall to keep out northern invaders. So people were trying to come from Mongolia, basically, through the Gobi Desert, and so they built a wall to try to keep those invaders out. The Han Empire continued this Great Wall to be kind of roughly the size that it is today. So although the Qin started it, it was really the Han that were famous for building the Great Wall that we know today. And again, they emphasize education, which resulted in that civil service examination I was talking about. So government officials must pass a test to work in government. So it was a merit system. It was an achievement, and position was based on your merit or your worth rather than who you know. or the family we're born into. So it's based on what you know versus who you know. All right, I want to talk about Han culture just for a moment. So the Han Dynasty had many great achievements, and yet they are not known as China's sort of quote-unquote golden age. So the Han Dynasty, some of their cultural achievements were that they issued standardized coinage as their currency. They emphasized Confucianism and respect for authority, ancestors, and the state. They developed paper-making process, and they wrote on scrolls. So remember, the Codex came 1,500 years after this, or 1,000 years after this, really, and that was when the Maya and the Aztecs kind of wrote on various pieces of bark. They didn't really even have paper, but the Chinese were the first civilization to develop paper. If you remember, if you're thinking, I thought the Egyptians were the first to do that. The Egyptians wrote on papyrus, which is similar to paper, but it is a different paper-making process. They also created a 365-day calendar about 300 years before the Maya. So the Maya did not get it from the Chinese. They came up with it on their own as well, but this kind of predated the Maya development of that 365-day calendar. They also developed what is known as the junk design of the ship. And instead of just a canoe or a small raft or something else that they found to float, they actually built these huge trading ships that allowed sailing on the high seas due to the unique rudder system. So this was very advanced technology, and not a lot of people had a boat capable of traveling on such open waters. So a lot of civilizations had boats that were fine for rivers or for coastal travel, but not for large-scale adventures as the Chinese developed during the Han Dynasty. They also, fun fact, invented the wheelbarrow about 150 BCE. So, with all this development in these goods and this cultural achievement, they begin to trade more frequently with other civilizations. And this is a theme that we're going to explore over the course of our World History 1 class. So this trade route is called the Silk Road. And it was established during the Han Dynasty and connected China, over here, Central Asia, and all the way into Western Europe and the Roman Empire. Remember I said Han China and the Roman Empire were contemporaneous, which means they existed at the same time. They also traded with the Byzantine Empire, who we'll visit in a few units. So it was once the path of nomadic herders and traders, but eventually they unified the trading route and was often protected by those various trading ports. So it would be protected at different places. There were huge marketplaces or bazaars as you went through all these different civilizations, and not only were the Chinese spreading their cultural achievements and their goods, and such as silk, which is why it was called the Silk Road, but they were also getting things from all these other places. So not only, so once again, named Silk Road after China's monopoly on the luxury item of silk. So again, mono means one, and they're the only one that sells the good, so they can charge as much as they want for it. So that's why it was a luxury item. And silk was in very high demand in European markets because they couldn't get it anywhere else. And just a quick plug for the gender roles here, women were largely in charge of the production of silk. And so while the economic focus of the Silk Road was upon luxury goods, it nevertheless marked unprecedented. And this word unprecedented, if you want to write down the definition, it means never before seen. You're going to see this word again and again. Unprecedented interactions, never before seen level of interactions between cultures spanning from Europe to Asia. So not only were these goods being spread across these continents from different civilizations, but their ideas were being exchanged, or their culture was being exchanged. And this concept is known as cultural diffusion. So cultural diffusion is the exchange of ideas between cultures across geographic areas. So keep all those things in mind as you take your quiz on Canvas. The end.